Well, one of my subscribers, Gypsy Hustle, several times has asked me if I know or if I'd like to do a video with YouTube user Demcad, and pretty sure the only reason he asks me this, not repeatedly, but once or twice, is because he knows we're both from Michigan. So I guess that means we must know each other. From what I can tell, I subscribe to Demcad. I don't really watch most of his videos. I watch him every once in a while. From what I can tell, he lives in Flint, and I live in northern Michigan, so 3 or 4 hours away from him. And really, for all intents and purposes, it's a different state. I mean, I live in a very rural, foresty, agriculturally hunting kind of area, and he lives in more or less the quintessential Rust Belt urban center. So I don't know Demcad. As far as I'm aware, he is unaware of my existence, and I don't know. I don't feel the need to talk to him, but the idea, thinking about it, I think the only thing that we would likely talk about would be Detroit, and that just suddenly put it in my mind to talk about Detroit. I'm not from Detroit, but my family is from Detroit. I've been there many times, and although I'm certainly not an expert, I guess you could say that I would have a clearer, better perspective on it than, say, somebody in Iceland, for instance. Just to pick a random country for which I have no connection or interest. And I think, in a funny way, the story of what's happened and what is happening to Detroit is very similar to the Austrian theory of the business cycle, booms and busts, and what needs to happen to capital, goods, and resources when they become bankrupts. Now, Detroit has, at one time, was very much had a reputation, and perhaps deservedly, as more or less a paragon of capitalism and industrialism. It is, of course, the den of Henry Ford and General Motors, and who is, Ford especially, is in many ways the quintessential Horatio Alger entrepreneurial man. He's one of the richest men in all history, and besides him, there are many, many, many others of the same level. There are, even today, thousands and thousands, literally, of millionaires in the Detroit area. And at some point, and even the experts are going to disagree, Detroit changed. I know what my relatives think. It's not politically correct, but it's certainly not it's not an uncommon line of reasoning. But now the city is actually one of the, as opposed to being a free market capitalist center, it really is a hotbed for socialism and Marxism. In the United States, Marxism and socialism, real overt kind, is pretty rare. Like, the rhetoric is pretty common with the Democrats and even the Republican parties, but the real explicit bust of Karl Marx, workers need to take over, overthrow the proletariat, whatever, that's pretty rare. It has a strong showing in Detroit. I've encountered plenty of communists from there, plenty of communist organizations from there. There's lots of Marxist organizations that are based there. The rhetoric that emanates both from the city and also from, like, some of the unions, which the unions are a mixed bag, but like they have very red strains in them, and their lair is in the Detroit area, and the city has had an expressly socialist bent. I don't want to put a date on it, but at some point in the 60s probably. I have a history book that was written in the late 50s, and at that point Detroit was probably, I think it was the third largest city in the United States. It was New York. It was before LA was the second biggest, and it was like New York, Chicago, Detroit. It had a population, like, someone's going to look this up and tell me I'm way off, but it was like 3 or 4 million. And Last I checked this year, I think they're estimating it's more like 750,000. And it's now a cliche example of a failed society. I mean, parts of it look like Mogadishu. Uh, Huge areas of it are completely abandoned, completely dilapidated, and then there are other areas which aren't so bad. And then there are these really amazing, like there was going to be a new train station, and it's just this amazing Art Deco cathedral basically that was never finished, and now it's just vacant, full of wild dogs and goats and gangs. And there are entire neighborhoods that are all the houses are gone and they're just overgrown, and there's deer and pheasants. And there's a website called The Ruins of Detroit that has a lot of pictures of it. There's also a documentary made by a French film company that explores the change. And I think whatever the reasons for its downfall, and I would have my guesses, but I honestly have never really figured it out. It doesn't. Are at this point irrelevant. The point is that the city that used to be there uh, has to change. It has to be different. Whatever it was that made the city the way it was before is no longer that way. Maybe this because there's different people, maybe because people left, maybe because the economy has changed. Who knows? And the problem with the government in Detroit is that they want to retain and recreate exactly what was there. And the thing is, the market has changed. The needs of consumers, and when I say that, I mean of everybody who would in any way have any kind of commerce in Detroit, directly or indirectly, have changed. And so in the late 70s, or maybe it was the early 80s, and several times the city has embarked to revitalize the city through massive public works spending. And the most glaring example is the so-called Renaissance Center, which is now the tallest building in Detroit. I think GM at least used to. I don't know if it still does has its headquarters there, but it's a complex, I think, of 5 towers, one that's the tallest and 4 around it that are almost as tall. And of course, the name Renaissance was deliberate to try and indicate that it would be a rebirth. And I've seen videos, people who get tours of the cities, they are taken to the Renaissance Center, and it is explicitly stated that it failed because the government in Detroit, the city council, are trying to rebuild the past, and things have changed. The city needs to change, and unfortunately, government hinders that process enormously. Now, I think it is interesting because I think it may have more or less hit rock bottom now. I could imagine it getting worse, but at this point, prices have fallen so far, and there's so much potential useful things there. I've heard of a guy, 22-year-old kid, and he owns a factory, and it's about 1 square block, and it's 9 stories high. How many people in the world, how many 22-year-old kids can own a 9-story factory that's probably got, 100,000 square feet? I don't know, not that much, but thousands and thousands of square feet with a big lifting elevator and everything. And the whole thing's vacant. It hadn't been used for years and years, and there's lots of vacant factories like that. There are factories that were closed in the 50s that are still there. And what needs to happen with this stuff? Well, nobody knows. The problem with the city council and with the government is they think they have an idea of what it's supposed to be for. And so if you don't do that, they won't allow you to do anything. They think that factory has to be used to make car parts. I have news for you, man. They're making those parts in Mexico now. That factory is still useful. If they would just allow someone to come and say, I'll own it, and let them do whatever the fuck they want. And they're going to try and make money off it, and they're going to probably not succeed most of the time. And some of them eventually will. This guy who owns this apartment, he lives in part of it, I believe, this apartment, this factory. And then the other part of it he uses for like an art studio, which is something that's not that regulated. But if he was to try and start to manufacture something, all of a sudden, boom, they'd want their cut. They wouldn't let him do it unless he fulfilled a certain number of regulatory requirements, and they're going to hinder the process. that he's going to need even more capital. He didn't need much to get it. That's the thing. When the prices fall, it makes it possible for these things to change. When a factory needs to close, then it needs to fall into receivership to whoever its debtors are or to some new owner to try and use it. But if you tell the new owner that he has to keep building Ford cars there, and the building Ford cars that made them go out of business in the first place, that isn't going to help. It's just going to sit there and idle, or as the Soviets would like to say, in technological preservation, which is another way to say it's mothballed and can't be used. There's a reason Detroit became rich. It's on a great waterway. The Great Lakes are an amazing resource for transit and for commerce. It's part of the reason it became so, because you can get goods from Chicago, from Duluth, from Cleveland, from the Atlantic Ocean. And you can get coal from Appalachia and all kinds of stuff. And the land there is still very useful, and there's still factories there. There's still useful capital goods. But the city handicaps anybody who wants to use them for anything. Even if they want to use them for their original purpose, they'll get taxed, they'll get regulated. The city will want a big cut. Because basically the way the government looks at it is, the problem is the government doesn't have enough money to fix everything. And so if you want to come and try and create wealth, to create a service or a good, they don't see that as in and of itself beneficial. They see that as something that they can extract from so that they can then be the heroes. And they can't. They've been trying to be the heroes now for my entire lifetime. I was born in the early 80s, 1983, give my age away. And my whole life, Detroit has been declined. My whole family, my grandmother, my parents, my uncles and aunts, their lifetimes, for my grandmother, Detroit rose, and she lived through the apogee, through the zenith of its greatness. And then she witnessed it fall for half her lifetime, or more than half her lifetime. My parents, when they were young, when they were kids, was about when it was at its maximum. And basically their whole lifetimes was a steady drop. Steady drop. My life, well, the time I was born, people thought I was at rock bottom. And it depends on how you want to, in terms of violent crime, I think it did hit rock bottom either in the 80s or maybe in the early 90s. Its crime isn't quite as Somalian in scale as it used to be. But in terms of unemployment, it's as bad now or worse than it ever was, and it's still getting worse. So those resources need to be reallocated, and the government needs to let that process happen. And until they do, it's either going to stagnate or get worse. So it's a lesson to us all. It's a sad story, too.